Hey everyone, welcome back to The Daily Past. Today, we're going to dive into a topic that's been a point of contention in international relations for decades. We're talking about why Russia was denied NATO membership after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And, perhaps more intriguingly, was this denial a missed opportunity for global peace? Now, this is a really complex subject. To understand why things unfolded the way they did, we need to consider history, politics, military strategy, and yes, even economic interests, especially within the United States. As we go through this, we'll explore the possibility that the decision to exclude Russia from NATO might have fundamentally changed the global order, maybe for the better, maybe not. But it's an important question to ask. So, buckle up as we dig deep into this fascinating moment in history. Alright, let's set the scene. Okay, let's rewind the clock to the early 1990s. We're talking about a moment in history that's hard to overstate. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union, that had been the United States' primary rival for almost half a century, has just collapsed. The Berlin Wall has fallen, Germany has reunified, and the entire world is on the verge of something new. And if you're in Russia at that time, things are incredibly unstable. The Soviet system has collapsed. The economy is in free fall, people are struggling, and there's a lot of political uncertainty. It's a nation, the heart of the former Soviet Empire, that's suddenly thrown into the unknown. But here's the question on the minds of Russia's leadership, especially Boris Yeltsin: how does Russia navigate this new world? How do you go from being the superpower on the world stage to, well, what? What's next for Russia? And that's where NATO comes into the picture. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. NATO? The alliance that spent decades as the Soviet Union's main antagonist? Yes, that NATO. But, believe it or not, Russia, in the early 1990s, is seriously considering joining NATO. This isn't about becoming enemies anymore, not in the way the Cold War framed things. It's about being partners, about integrating into Europe, and maybe even gaining some security guarantees after all the chaos. At the time, Yeltsin's foreign minister, Andrei Kozyrev, is openly exploring the possibility of NATO membership, not just as a way to align militarily, but to open up new economic opportunities. For Russia, the idea of NATO membership is about securing stability, politically and economically. They want to stabilize the country and reduce the uncertainty that came with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, think about it. Russia, after decades of being isolated behind the Iron Curtain, was desperately looking for a way to integrate into the Western world. NATO, despite its Cold War roots, was now viewed as something else, something that could bring security, economic cooperation, and even a degree of legitimacy on the global stage. It wasn't just about military strategy. Yeltsin and others were looking at this through a more expansive lens. Joining NATO could be a way of saying, hey, we're part of Europe now. We're not the enemy anymore. It's a signal that Russia wanted to leave the isolation of its Soviet past behind. NATO membership was seen by many as a way to stabilize Russia and to help guide it into a new era, one of greater cooperation with the West. But, and here's the tricky part, things start to get complicated. Really complicated. Let's hit the pause button for a second and look at another key moment in history, the reunification of Germany. It's 1990, and the world is still reeling from the end of the Cold War. A unified Germany was always going to be a big deal, right? But during the talks on how to bring Germany back together, the Soviet Union, now just Russia, was promised something important. James Baker, the US Secretary of State, made a promise to Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, during those pivotal talks. He famously told Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. Now, this wasn't written into any official document or treaty, but it was a verbal assurance, something that, at the time, seemed like a solid agreement. To many in Moscow, this was a promise that NATO would not move closer to Russian borders. So, fast forward a few years. NATO begins expanding eastward. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic officially joined NATO in 1999, just a few short years after the fall of the Soviet Union. From Russia's perspective, this is a betrayal, a broken promise. Now, imagine the feeling in Moscow. Russia had been led to believe that NATO wouldn't push its borders any further. But here it was, former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact countries signing up for NATO membership. In Russia's eyes, these were not just new members of an alliance. They were once part of the Soviet sphere of influence, and now they were aligning themselves with the very organization that had been created to contain the USSR. This shift triggered not just disappointment but anger in Moscow. They had agreed to the reunification of Germany with the understanding that NATO would respect Russia's strategic boundaries. But now, as NATO expanded east, the sense of betrayal only deepened. But here's where it gets interesting. It wasn't just about broken promises. There were deeper, more strategic concerns. NATO's actions were about more than simply admitting new members. Russia saw these moves as part of a broader geopolitical strategy, one that was undermining its security and influence in Europe. And that set the stage for a deepening divide between Russia and the West. Alright, let's dig into something that might surprise you, the US military-industrial complex. Or, as some like to call it, the deep state. Now, I know, when people throw around the term deep state, it can sound a little, well, over the top. But hear me out. NATO, for all its roles in promoting security, is also deeply intertwined with the US defense industry. And in the post-Cold War world, NATO became more than just a military alliance, it became a huge economic driver for the US military-industrial complex. Think about it, NATO isn't just a peacekeeping force, it's a global customer base for American weapons, technology, and military services. Major defense companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing all have a huge stake in the alliance's operations. They're selling fighter jets, missiles, and military equipment to NATO member states, and making a lot of money doing it. NATO is a billion-dollar business for these companies. So, here's the thing, if Russia had joined NATO, it would have completely changed the game. For one, NATO would have shifted from being a US-dominated military alliance to something far more multilateral, where Russia's input would have carried weight. Russia has one of the world's largest and most powerful militaries, and their participation would have shaped NATO's strategic direction in a major way. And here's the real kicker, the US defense industry would have lost a massive customer. Without Russia as a perceived threat, NATO's military spending might have been reduced. The US would have had less justification for its military bases in Europe, and its arms sales to NATO allies might have dropped significantly. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't to say that all of US foreign policy was driven by defense contractors. But it's clear that there were powerful interests at work. And these interests, specifically those tied to the military-industrial complex, probably didn't want Russia joining NATO. Because, if Russia became a NATO member, they'd be less inclined to buy the US's defense products at the scale they were accustomed to. In other words, the deep state, those entrenched interests within the US military and intelligence agencies, had a lot to gain by keeping Russia outside NATO. The economic power of the US military-industrial complex and its ability to shape global defense policy was simply too strong to ignore. Keeping NATO's expansion on track, while excluding Russia, was likely seen as essential for maintaining the US's geopolitical dominance. This was about global control and economic influence, something that was likely much more of a priority than any diplomatic overtures toward Moscow. Alright, let's talk about Russia's reaction to NATO's expansion in the late 1990s and early 2000s. It's a turning point in this whole narrative. You know, at first, it wasn't just the inclusion of countries like Poland and Hungary that upset Russia. I mean, yes, those were significant moves, but what really started to concern them was the sense that NATO wasn't the same defensive alliance it used to be. See, NATO was always about countering the Soviet Union during the Cold War, protecting Europe from the spread of communism, essentially. But by the late 90s and early 2000s, NATO started acting beyond its original mandate. Kosovo in 1999, for example. That's when NATO bombed Serbia without the approval of the UN, and for Russia, that was a game changer. Now, think about this for a second. Serbia, for Russia, was not just another country. Serbia was one of their traditional allies in the Balkans, a region they'd had deep historical ties with, culturally and politically. So, when NATO took military action against Serbia, Russia saw it as a direct challenge to their sphere of influence. And the fact that NATO acted without UN approval made it even worse. It wasn't just about the military strike. It was about NATO stepping outside its original role as a defensive alliance. Russia saw NATO's actions as signaling a shift towards interventionism, becoming a force that was no longer just about defense but about imposing its will on other countries. And that, for Russia, was unacceptable. They could not accept this new role NATO had carved out for itself, especially when it involved actions that violated international norms. The moment NATO acted unilaterally, Russia's view of the alliance fundamentally changed. They went from considering NATO as a potential partner to an outright opponent. From that point on, Russia began to see NATO's expansion and its interventionist tendencies as a threat. And this was just the beginning of a wider shift in Russia's foreign policy, one that was marked by a growing sense of hostility towards NATO and the West as a whole. So, here's the big question: what if things had gone differently? What if, back in the 1990s, Russia had actually been invited into NATO? Could that have changed the course of history? Could it have led to a more peaceful world? Well, let's explore this for a second. There's no shortage of compelling arguments suggesting that NATO membership for Russia might have been a game changer. Just imagine a Europe where NATO wasn't just a US-led military alliance, but a truly multilateral organization, one with both Russia and the United States sitting at the table, working together for European security. This could have completely shifted the security dynamics of the entire region. Instead of viewing each other as adversaries, the West and Russia might have worked as partners. It could have reduced the security tensions, especially in regions like the Balkans, where NATO's military interventions often caused deep friction with Russia. And economically, Russia's inclusion in NATO could have opened up a world of opportunities. Trade, technology exchanges, even arms control could have been potential areas of cooperation. Russia, with its vast resources and expertise, could have been integrated into the European economic system, helping to reduce the kind of tensions and isolation that have grown between Russia and the West over the past few decades. But, of course, this never happened. And here we are today, dealing with the consequences of that missed opportunity. We have a world where Russia remains outside NATO, increasingly opposed to the West, and constantly on the defensive when it comes to international relations. Think about how different things could have been. But, unfortunately, the window for that kind of partnership closed long ago. So, we're left wondering, what could have been if the West had embraced Russia as a partner instead of viewing it as a competitor? So, was Russia's exclusion from NATO a missed opportunity for global peace? It's a complicated question, and honestly, it's hard to say for certain. But, one thing is clear: if the West had viewed Russia as a partner, rather than a competitor, the world we live in today might have looked very different. Could it have led to a more peaceful and stable Europe? Could it have helped ease tensions and foster cooperation, instead of deepening divisions? It's possible, but now, it's your turn. What do you think? Do you believe Russia joining NATO in the 1990s could have brought about a more peaceful world? Or was NATO's expansion, despite the broken promises, a necessary step in shaping the modern European security order? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep watching the Daily Past.